We read in the scripture from Luke chapter 10, verse 29 to 37. Luke chapter 10, verse 29 to 37. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And in reply said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." The word of the Lord.
Good morning. And I just want to say especially thank you to the musicians and to Kingsley for reading the scripture. It was really just perfect and just a perfect lead-in to what I have to share, and so thank you for that. It is a delight for me to be able to share a little bit of my story and my personal journey with you this morning. Some of you may remember that earlier this year we had a storying series where those who spoke told their story, and because of scheduling, I didn't get scheduled at that point, but Clayton said, "Oh, just still tell your story. It's okay if it's a little out of the order." So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go to my first picture, and I hope, yep, okay. Going to go to my first picture here, and just share a little bit of my story. It starts with who I am in the context of my family. This picture is of my siblings and me. I'm the one with the broken leg and the glasses. Always the glasses. Every family picture you see, I'm the one with the glasses. Probably dates me a bit to show you that this picture is black and white, but those were pictures in the 60s. We're in black and white. But one of the things I love about this picture being black and white is that often as we look back at our stories, I think we sometimes feel like we see them in black and white, or a little faded out, or not in full color. We don't have all the color filled in. And so our scripture reading today, which Kingsley read for us, and I won't read it again, but perhaps was a passage very familiar to many of you. And I'm going to ask you to consider, as we walk through this passage this morning and as I share my journey, how this passage relates to you, and where have others stopped for you along the way, and where have others listened to you, and where have others passed you by when they should have stopped. And some of you, where have you been the Good Samaritan to others? Where have you said, "That's me"? And as Clayton told us earlier today, this day, March 25th, marks the day that we celebrate the Incarnation, 9 months before Christmas, which I just love that I get to speak on this day, because in some ways, it's the Incarnation represents the gospel, and I will tell you that the gospel is all over my story. So let's take a look briefly at the passage and note the characters of the traveler, the robbers, the priest, the religious scholar, the Levite, and of course, the Samaritan. And so often when we look at this passage, we look from the perspective of the Samaritan who stopped and who gave care. But today I want to look at the story from the perspective of the wounded traveler, because for me, that's the character I relate to in this story. So Jesus tells a story, right, of a traveler. He's making his way down from Jerusalem. It's about an 18-mile journey And they used it regularly from to and from Jerusalem, which was their center of worship. And this 18-mile journey historically passed through a very rocky, dangerous wilderness. And as we know from the word, along the way, the traveler was assaulted by robbers. And let's be clear, he wasn't just held up. The word tells us that they stripped him, they beat him, they left him naked and half dead. In today's language, in the language of psychology and counseling, this man experienced the trauma of emotional and physical abuse and then was abandoned. And some of us, we may blame the traveler, and we say, well, he should have known better than to walk by himself. That was a dangerous, dangerous path. And maybe even the traveler himself thought, oh, if only I had been smarter, if only I hadn't been alone, if only I had taken a weapon with me to fight back, if only I had fought back. But the fact is that what happened didn't have anything to do with the fault of the traveler. This man, the traveler, and for me in my story, encountered the unexpected. Maybe there's some in this room, in fact, I'm quite sure there are, who have a similar story. Maybe there's part of your journey where you were going along, perhaps as a child, perhaps as a young adult, perhaps as an older adult, and in some way you were mistreated. You were assaulted. And this, as you look back, is not what you expected in your life at all. It's not what you expected your life to be, but it's your reality. My story involves a very sad, broken family, filled with all kinds of abuse. Pretty much the abuse that's in your head that you're thinking of right now was in some way present and prevalent and chronic and ongoing in my family. My father died when I was 2 years old. In this picture, I'm just before my 6th birthday. But when my father died when I was 2 and my brother was 3 months old. So my mom, in this picture, the one on the end, she was 27, had 5 children at that time, 10 and under. And this was taken right just days before she married my stepfather. Again, I'm the one in the glasses. But what's important for you to know about this picture is that all of us, the 5 of us in this picture, grew up in an abusive household. Neglect, chronic physical abuse, chronic sexual abuse. To say it this way, my family was chaotic and unpredictable. And those are the words that I would describe. And you may even notice that, hey, there's 5 kids in this picture, and there was only 4 in the first one you put up. I don't know if you noticed that, but that's because my oldest sister here, the one standing next to my mom got mad at her one day and signed her over for adoption just because she was angry with her when she was about 6. So this is the kind of chaos and unpredictability that I grew up in. And I will tell you that as I learned to engage my story, I didn't like it. Like I, for so long, thought, I don't like this story. It's hard for people to hear. They don't know how to respond. It's hard for me to tell. And yet, how do you integrate that with this is my reality, and this is who I am, and this is what has made me to be who I am? And I will tell you that this has been a journey of me and a journey of healing, which is why your music was so beautiful and so fitting, a journey of healing. But I will tell you this morning that I stand here and I love my story. And I have learned to love my story. And I love it because the gospel is all over it. I love it because it speaks of hope and redemption. But in my story, there are several good Samaritans along the way. Part of the reason that I stand here today and share this with you is because of the Good Samaritans in my life. In the story, we're told that a priest was traveling down the same road, and he saw the wounded man, and he moved as far away as he could. We don't know why. Maybe he was late for worship. Maybe he felt he was going to be ceremonially unclean, but for whatever reason, he passed by. And for some of us, this is actually a part of our story that sometimes there's someone in our story who could have helped, but for whatever reason, their theology, their busy life, they didn't stop. They didn't stop to help. So then a Levite, a religious scholar, shows up, right? He knew the law very well. And what was the law? Love God, love your neighbor. And remember, this is the group Jesus is telling the story to, right? But he also avoided the wounded man. And we don't know why. We don't know, was it that they were afraid they would be robbed? Was it that they were too busy, too important? But whatever reason, the priest and the religious scholar refused to get involved. So that traveler was just left on their own, on his own, bleeding. And in my life, the role of the priest and the religious scholar were actually played by a piano teacher and my church pastor, believe it or not. Because at this point in my life, the abuse was quite regular and had been going on for several years. But I'll tell you this, and some of you know this about me already, the piano was my escape. I became a devoted pianist. I was trained classically because when I played the piano, I could separate and move into this other world, and I could escape, and I wasn't wounded when I was playing the piano. So I had several piano teachers along the way, like many of you maybe who studied piano for a long time. One day I changed piano teachers, felt very connected to her, and for some reason, I told her what was going on at home. Still have no idea why I did it, but I told her. And she was a willing listener, and I mean, more than once. We talked weeks and weeks and weeks. She never did anything with what she heard. Never did anything. So while she listened to me, she didn't do anything to protect me, care for my wounds. And from a teenage heart, I concluded that that must mean that this was my fault. You know, if you tell someone in power that you're being wounded and they don't do anything, maybe it's a little irrational. But for me, I decided it must be my fault. That's why she doesn't want to tell, because I would get in big trouble if she told. And that was a lie. That was a lie that it has taken me a long time to combat and come to truly believe that what happened to me wasn't my fault. I didn't know the end of this story about my piano teacher till years later. I was in counseling, and my counselor suggested, why don't you write to that piano teacher and see if she can piece together some of your story for you? Because quite honestly, I had very few memories. I had faded snapshots, but I didn't have the story. I didn't have a videotape. And she said, hey, it sounds like you told this piano teacher a lot. Why don't you write to her? So I did. I wrote to her, and then she wrote me back. And she said, I am so glad you wrote to me. I have carried this for years. And she said, I was so disturbed. She was young when she was my piano teacher. She said, I was so disturbed at what was happening to you that I didn't know what to do. And I went and told the pastor, because I said, I don't know what to do. This is way beyond me. And he said, this is a very prominent family in our church. And we were. Don't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Our church has just recovered from a split. Ichabod has been walking up the path of this church, and I do not want this story to get out about this family and get in the way of what's happening good in this church. And that was the response of the pastor. The one who knew his role was to care for the wounded. That's what God had called him to do, to shepherd. The one who's charged by Scripture to protect children. But my story doesn't end there. And like the biblical story, if we go back, finally a man comes along, a Samaritan, who's a social outcast. He's despised. And he saw the wounded man, and he stopped. His heart went out to him. The Samaritan took what he had. It says his oil and his wine, and he cleaned the man, and he bandaged his wounds. And I just wonder, was this Samaritan's compassion fueled by the healing he had received and he had experienced? Because the Jews actually were quite offended and went out of their way to avoid Samaritans. And so no doubt this man, this Samaritan, knew what it was to be passed by. And here's where the journey of the Good Samaritan as well as mine becomes so beautiful. Because I really believe we can't show God's mercy to others until we grasp it ourselves, right? We tell our counseling students all the time, you can only take people as far as you've been yourself. And the book of Hebrews tells us that we have this high priest, Jesus, who has compassion for our wounds because Jesus was wounded like we were. He knows our pain. He knows our suffering. He knows what it is to have hope and be disappointed, to be wounded, and to be abandoned. And so this part of the story, the Good Samaritan coming by and doing something unexpected, this too is unexpected in this story. And I think as we encounter unexpected events, and as we look at unexpected events in our past, we can expect that we have a God who is also unexpected in our lives. So the Good Samaritan lifted the wounded traveler onto his donkey, carried him to an inn and a safe place, gave him care, offered to pay for his care, and said, give him whatever he needs to recover. The Samaritan was generous. And it's remarkable to me now. I have worked as a counselor with people with stories of harm for many, many years. It's remarkable to me that as I listen to stories, I can almost always hear about a Good Samaritan. Somewhere in many stories of wounding, there's a Good Samaritan. And so a bit of my story about who has stopped for me would have to have begun in 1989 when I moved to Thailand as a missionary. There I am with the big hair. But 1989, that was actually very stylish. I ended up living in Thailand as a missionary, Thailand and China, for 22 years. And at that point, the point in this story, this was my very first class I went over as a teacher to missionary children. I wasn't a counselor yet. I was an educator. My bachelor's degree was in English education. And so I hadn't told my story to anyone since I had told it to that piano teacher a number of years earlier, and she didn't do anything about it. I hadn't told my story. But when I moved to Thailand, I met a missionary woman on my team, and she had just come back from the US, having gotten all this great counseling in her own life for her own story of abuse in her life. And she recognized something in me, and she started to pursue me. And I was not wanting to be pursued, I will tell you. But she pursued me, much like the Good Samaritan. Oh, here she is, she and her husband. And this woman, as she told me her own story, it was the first time in my life that someone invited me to share about those issues. The first time in my life that I didn't feel like this is off limits. Don't talk about this. And in the past, when I told my story, it caused people, it seemed like with my piano teacher, she ran away. And now I was telling my story, and this woman came closer, much like the Good Samaritan. And this, too, was unexpected. It was a surprise for me. She and her husband ministered to me. They listened to my story. I had never been listened to, I don't think, in this way. And they also, huge part of my healing, offered me a place in their family, which happens often in missionary culture and missionary families. As a single woman, you don't have any place to be for holidays, and so a family will take you in. And this was huge for me because I had never experienced a healthy family system. And so my relationship with this couple began a journey in my life that I've been on, honestly, for the last 25 years. And in that 25 years, I could name a number of Samaritans who have ministered to me and who have cared for my wounds. I've been to personal counseling, which was remarkable and even informed my career. I attended recovery seminars. And I think that abuse recovery, happens a little bit at a time. We don't want it like that. We want okay, I want to deal with this. I want to go to counseling for 10 weeks and I want to deal with it. And but often abuse recovery doesn't happen like that. And so actually it was about 13 years ago, I was teaching 9th grade English, and they were all watching the video, The Birds, because we had just read this novelette in class. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I want to help other people. I want to help other people. I want to be a good Samaritan. And so I actually started my master's degree here at Wheaton. In 2001, this was my cohort. Some people you recognize, Dr. Buttman, Dr. Watson, Dr. Mangus, they're all three right there. I'm down there in the front. We all look so much younger. That's what we were remarking yesterday. But this was my cohort, and I want to tell you, Wheaton College Graduate School was a good Samaritan for me. It really was. Much of my graduate program here in counseling entailed assignments. As so many of you know, I see a lot of my students out there today, that caused me and required me to look at my own story, and that asked me to consider my woundedness and how was that going to impact my presence as a counselor. So this too, this school, this place, this became part of my journey. And I found at Wheaton a cohort who listened and who cared and who bandaged my wounds. And I made enormous progress, I think. So then I became a professional counselor, and I went back to Thailand in the role of a missionary counselor. My official job at that time was to be a counselor for missionary families. But at this point, I'd lived in Thailand a long time. I was fluent in the Thai language, and I was deeply, deeply attracted to ministry among those who had been sexually harmed. And so I also worked extensively in groups of children who had been trafficked, women who had been prostituted, men and women and children who lived in refugee camps. And much of my work was with orphaned children, like this picture here. In this time, I helped after natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis, and all of that was birthed here at Wheaton, but also before that, when God gave me a story and allowed people to be good Samaritans to me. Now I could be the good Samaritan, stopping to help others, binding their wounds, offering them a safe place to rest and heal. And it really is a remarkable story, isn't it? I mean, how he takes the broken, the wounded. I am definitely less than whole. Ask any of my colleagues. And uses that person to bring goodness to others and to bring healing to others. And so in this week, before Holy Week, this type of story of God taking evil events and turning them into goodness seems really fitting. Because I think that's the essence of the gospel. That's the essence of the incarnation. What does the gospel teach us? First death, then life. First pain, then joy. First great suffering, and then great glory. But so often in our culture, we have said we don't want to talk about death and pain and suffering in our stories. We just want life and joy and glory. But that's not the gospel. That's not the gospel that I know. And this right here, this whole application of the gospel to my story, this is why I've come to love my story. And that I can tell you, it is full of tragedy, it is full of brokenness, but it is also filled with the power of the gospel, alive and full of passion and full of life. And so as I've told this story this morning, maybe some of you have been stirred up by elements of your own story. Maybe there's someone here who's never shared their story of harm. Because in some way, we're all wounded travelers, aren't we? In some ways. And we all need good Samaritans in our lives. So I encourage you, if you've been stirred, please allow this Wheaton community to be a good Samaritan to you and to minister to you. And some of you, actually, I know this too, grew up in beautiful homes. And for you, you think, I really remember having friends who grew up in amazing godly homes who would say, I don't even have a story, but I want to say stop, because we need you to stop for the wounded traveler. We can all be part of a community, something like creating the inn, I-N-N, that place of rest, that place that cares for people on their journey of restoration. And in this community with one another, we can learn to give and receive mercy and love, and then find that life that God is calling us to.